Well, in the spring of 2010, Ryan and I could no longer delay the inevitable. We knew that we were supposed to move from Minnesota to somewhere to plant a church. And this knowing had taken root about a year and a half earlier, and it was time to make a move. Our denomination, who I mentioned earlier, they were chomping at the bit to send us anywhere. We had already gone through a long assessment process to be recommended for church planting, and all we had to do was tell them when we were ready and where we wanted to go. Now, that was awesome because I had a lot of suggestions. We were in Minnesota, and it was spring, and it was not warm yet, and all of my suggestions included a place that had salt air. Can you blame me? No. But it wasn't all me, okay? Ryan forever, even when he was younger, had felt this pull toward the west. So we knew that we wanted to head west, but we didn't know exactly where. And so our denomination is set up in such a way that there is leadership in different conferences, different regions around the country. And so Ryan called up a guy named Wayne, who is in charge of the Pacific Southwest Conference of States. And Wayne was the director of church planning, and he was the one tasked with finding people to go and plant churches in California, Arizona, Nevada. So he contacted him. We were off and running. We were very excited. There's just one problem. Wayne wanted to meet Ryan to talk about all of these things in Las Vegas, not California. I didn't know how I felt about that, but Wayne had said, hey, listen, we've been trying to plant churches in Nevada. Nobody wants to come. Have you ever thought about Las Vegas? And Ryan's like, no, we never think about Las Vegas. And I'm like, that's ridiculous, right? We were not going to raise, we had 3 kids under 5 at the time. We were not going to move them to Las Vegas. But, like a dummy, or maybe a smart person, I don't know, Ryan gets on the plane anyway, okay? So he gets on the plane, he flies to Las Vegas, he meets Wayne. He's there for 24 hours, and Wayne's showing him around and telling him all this stuff. He met with this couple there who had been long-term members of the Covenant Church, and they were living in Las Vegas, and they had been sending letter after letter after letter, year after year to the Covenant saying, why is there no Covenant Church in Nevada, in Las Vegas? So he told me about them. He said, listen, you would really actually like it there. This Summerlin area where they want us to plant the church, it's really nice, it's safe, it's beautiful. I think it kind of fits you and your Southern California champagne taste. So I was like, okay, this is kind of sounding good. And he's like, and the best part is the Covenant will just fly you out there and you can go check it out and just see. And so this all sounded really, really good. Except in the back of my mind, I'm going, but if we go through with this, we're going to have to tell some people who are real, real people who are real close to us, that we are moving our children to Sin City. And so Ryan comes home from that railroad trip. We're talking. We stayed up real late that night talking, and we went around and around about it until the wee hours of the morning, at which point, after talking it out, we decided, you know what, Las Vegas is just a bridge too far for us. It's just not something we need to do. We do not need, and the Covenant does not need, and God does not need us to be the heroes to swoop into this city and attempt something so lofty in a place so low. They can find somebody else for the job. It's not us. It's not. So we balked because we just thought, you know what, we don't have the shoulders and we don't have the skills to bear that kind of burden, which is all a very long way of saying we didn't want to do it. We just didn't want to go to Las Vegas. And so Ryan got up the next morning, he called Wayne, and he told Wayne no. And Wayne said, okay, sorry to hear that. Here's the deal. I'm going on a sabbatical for a month. When I come back, we'll get together with Kristen and we'll figure out another way to go. So Wayne leaves on sabbatical, and that forced us into this month-long holding pattern with plenty of time to devise an entirely new plan. One that would land us in Oceanside or Ventura, California. It was a very good plan, you guys. Very good. Until a few weeks into that, when it started to reek of fish. Yeah, we'll get back to that in a minute. Just know I promised you a cruise, so we're going on one. All right, so welcome to the fourth and final week of our four-letter word series where we have been looking at the word obey. And we have been trying to reframe how we see it. We've been trying to see it not as a word to be despised or balked at, but as an opportunity to grow and develop into the people God is calling us to be. We've talked about how obedience is the fuel for change, for the change that we desire to see in our life. Obedience is what's going to fuel that and propel us forward. Talks about how the scriptures give us clear instructions for where to start and how to do that. And last week, we talked about what we can do when we mess up. And today, I'm going to walk us through some things we can do when we flat out don't want to obey. Because oftentimes, guys, like our sin and our disobedience is just a product of our own selfishness, of our not wanting to. We just don't want to, plain and simple. Because doesn't sin sometimes just feel like a far better, more fun, easier option? It really does. And so we're going to hit this with some truth today. And to do that, we're going to look at one of the Bible's most notorious disobeyers, and arguably like the biggest whiner in the Bible. And because this guy, Jonah, is such a whiner, he's just a whiny baby, I decided, hey, why don't I find the storybook Bible I used to read to my kids when they were whiny babies, and I'm going to introduce you to Jonah here. Okay, so you don't even need your YouVersion app for this part. If you want to get it out and get ready, great. But just sit back and let's just have a little story time. All right? All right, so we're going to be in, well, I don't know where we are. This is Jesus Storybook Bible. Just go with it, people. All right, so it's titled God's Messenger. God had a job for Jonah, but Jonah didn't want it. Go to Nineveh, God said, and tell your worst enemies that I love them. No, said Jonah. Those are bad people doing bad things. Exactly, God said. They have run far away from me, but I can't stop loving them. I will give them a new start. I will forgive them. No, said Jonah. They don't deserve it. I know what I'll do. I'll run away, Jonah said to himself. Far away, so far away that God won't be able to find me. Then I won't have to do what God says. It's a good plan. Because as far as he knew, it was a good plan. But of course, it wasn't a good plan at all. It was a silly plan. Because you can run away from God, but he will always come find you. Jonah went ahead with his not very good plan. One ticket to not Nineveh, please, he said. And he boarded a boat sailing in the very opposite direction of Nineveh. This is not going to go well for little Jonah. All right, here's the deal. Jonah was one of God's prophets. He was this man who was chosen by God to bring God's message of salvation to the nation of Israel. He was a popular preacher in a prosperous time, and nothing about going to Nineveh seemed logical or appealing. In fact, everything about it posed a threat to Jonah's convenience and his security and his status and all the things. Nineveh was a bitter enemy of Israel, and Jonah would have liked to have seen it destroyed because from his perspective, it was a barbaric place that, if spared, would remain a thorn in Israel's side. So no way was he going to go there and help those fools get right with Jesus. If God needed a hero, he could find someone else to swoop in and attempt something so lofty in a place so low. So, Jonah 1:3, it says, Jonah got up and he went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. All right, and then as you have probably heard, I hope you've heard, things go all kinds of bonkers. So, let's see. God sends a storm, right? He sends a storm. Things go crazy. The other sailors on the boat are freaking out, like, what is going on? And Jonah's like, I think I might know. I think I might have something to do with this. So He's like, just throw me overboard and you'll all be spared. So they're like, heck yeah, we're throwing you overboard. So they toss him overboard. The sea calms down, lucky for them, but Jonah's tumbling to the bottom of the sea, and then God sends this really big fish to swallow Jonah up. And then, essentially what happens is God puts Jonah in the world's most disgusting timeout for 3 days and 3 nights to think about what he's done. Parents, don't you wish you could do this sometimes? All right, we're all laughing because it's completely absurd, right? But you guys, this really happened. So it's totally like God, okay? Because when we disobey, short of doing something inconsistent with his character, God will go to any length to get our attention and to bring us back to him and to scoop us up and put us back on dry land and push us out in the direction that he originally called us to go in the first place. So, we're going to look at Jonah because I know that I'm poking fun of him right now. But before we're too quick to write him off as just a comic example of human disobedience, let's lean in and see what his story has to teach us about what we should do when we don't want to obey. And, I think that of all the things we've talked about in this series, not wanting to obey might be where we get tripped up the most. Because not wanting to obey was our original problem, was it not? So God goes out and he makes the trees and the trees grow and he makes the ocean and it does its thing and the fish swim and the birds fly and the sounds make their sounds and the rocks cry out and all this stuff. And then he gets to people and they just look at him and go, I don't want to listen to you. I want to go check out what's on that tree over there. And so Adam and Eve just didn't want to obey God. And so this is where this all starts. And Pastor David Platt says it so beautifully. He says, everything in all creation responds in obedience to the Creator until we get to you and me. We have the audacity to look God in the face and say no. So, we got a big problem. We need to get better at this. So, from Jonah's story, I see 3 things that we can do when we just don't want to. All right? Let's jump in. So, when we don't want to, the first thing we need to do is follow the advice of the prophet Ice Cube, who said, the first thing you need to do is check yourself before you. Okay, good. I wasn't worried. I was a little worried how that would go. All right? We need to check yourself. And in particular, I want you to check 2 things. Number 1, your attitude. Ow, I know. Jonah's reason for running was quite simply, he did not like the Assyrians. Assyria was this idolatrous, proud, and ruthless nation bent on taking over the world and had long been a threat to Israel, like I mentioned. And so when God said, hey, Jonah, I want you to go be a missionary to the capital in Nineveh, Jonah balked because selfishly, he wanted God to destroy Nineveh. His attitude was that they deserve God's judgment, not God's mercy. And at the very end of all of this, Jonah even confesses this. He says in Jonah 4:2, he's talking to us and he's like, hey, listen, that is why I was so quick to flee Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. So Jonah didn't want to see God's mercy extended to his enemies. And that kind of attitude just flew in the face of God's intention that everyone receives salvation. Everyone who repents, everyone who turns back receives salvation. And so the lesson here for us is that if you are balking at something that God is calling you to do, it might be because something in your attitude is misaligned with God's desires and his mission. And this is why David, who we talked a lot about last week, we spent a lot of time with him, he says in Psalm 139, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. What David knew is that there is always a deeper issue at hand. Always. And as a side note, we see this with kids, right? So I have people come to me all the time, Kristen, yeah, my kid is just picky. They're just a picky eater. I'm like, your kid's not picky. He's disobedient. I'm like, you have a little kid who has totally got you whipped. It's not about the food. It's about the fact that he does not want to obey your instructions. The end. Right? So we see this, and some of us can see this, but we see this in little kids, but then aren't we kids? Like, we do the same thing. There is always a deeper issue. Things like selfishness or arrogance or laziness might be at the root of your not wanting to do what God says. So just take a minute and check and see. So you're going to check yourself by checking your attitude first. And the second thing you're going to check are your idols. Is there something, or maybe several somethings, that you are worshiping more than God right now? And are those things getting in the way of you obeying him? Now listen, I'm not going to make you share yours out loud, but since I have a mic, I might as well share mine. So honestly, you guys, I am 100% right now worshiping a comfort idol. Because here's the thing. Every time I come out of a really difficult season, which for me the last 2 years have been that is another message entirely, but it has been a long 2 years. Been through some stuff. And historically, every time I come out of one of these really hard seasons, Satan rolls out this golden calf of comfort, and I bow to it every time. And what happens is that I become more focused on keeping myself safe and small and numbed out than I do on taking risks and stepping out into the places and relationships where God wants me to boldly go and give him away. That's just truth. And I know some of you know what I'm talking about because you have been through it the last couple of years. You may be going through it now, and you just want to bundle up with Netflix and a glass of whatever and shut the rest of the world out. And don't get me wrong, there is absolutely a time and a place for this. You need to rest, and you need to heal. But there is also a time to get up, pick up your mat, and walk in obedience towards the things Jesus is calling you to do and be in this world. And your comfort is going to have to once again take a back seat. So when you don't want to obey, check your idols. What are you worshiping more than God right now? Is it a relationship? A career path? Streaming service? An aisle at Trader Joe's? A particular social media platform? Sports team? A grudge? Your family? Number on a scale? Your image? Reputation? What is it? Name it. There is power in naming it. Because when you name it, it loses its power. The Bible says no one can serve two masters. You cannot obey God and be enslaved to these other things. You have to be free. You cannot be in bondage. And this is one of the many things that Jonah realizes in his time out. He prays, and at the end of it, he realizes, wow, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. And if we're turning away from God's love and turning to all these other things, we are so distracted and we are going down that wrong path, right? This is still up if you can see it from yesterday. We are like getting off the path hardcore. And it's not good. We got to circle back around and get there, all right? Which brings us to the second thing that Jonah does that we need to also do when we don't want to obey. We need to talk it out. We have to pray. when we don't feel like obeying, we have to ask God to help us, especially when our disobedience leads to distress, disorientation, and, dining on fish guts. Prayer gives us perspective, and perspective gives us plenty of reasons to pursue the things God has set before us. For Jonah, obey stopped sounding like a four-letter word after he spent some serious time talking things out with God inside the fish. As he prayed, he realized that he needed God's mercy and grace and forgiveness as much, if not more, than the people in Nineveh. And this realization allowed him to turn back to that path of obedience and recommit to the work at hand. And you can read his entire prayer in Jonah 2. I encourage you to do that. You can kind of see how the light bulbs start going off for him. But here's how it ends. In Jonah 2, verses 9 and 10, he says, I am worshiping you, God, calling out in thanksgiving. I'll do what I promised I'd do. Salvation belongs to God. Jonah doesn't get to say who's saved. God does. Then Jonah spoke to the fish, and it vomited up Jonah on the seashore. You're welcome for that visual. So listen. Brian and I had our own belly of the fish awakening during that end of the month while we were waiting for Wayne to get back from his sabbatical. The further we got into that month and the further we tried to walk toward the beach and away from the desert, things just started to feel really unsettled and weird, and pieces just weren't dropping into place, and we just felt agitated about it, and it wasn't clear. And clarity didn't come until we decided, you know what? Wayne is coming back in 2 days. We are going to give our kids to our family. We're going to go away for a day, and we are going to fast, and we are going to pray and pray and pray and pray some more and figure this out. And so we hunkered down in our favorite St. Paul coffee shop, and we talked with each other, and we talked with God, and we started to kind of outline this vision for this church that we knew God was calling us to plant. And as we did this, as we prayed, and as we talked to each other, we started to wonder, wait, does location even matter? If God is calling us to plant this church that's going to connect people far from God to Jesus and others and help mobilize them into their worlds, did it really matter if we were doing that on beach sand or desert sand? Would we not do it? And so out of that came this question that prior to that day of fasting and praying, we had both been too afraid to ask each other. And God bless him, Ryan asked it first. He said to me, I'll never forget it, he said, do you think we gave up on Vegas too soon? And I could not get the word yes out of my mouth fast enough because I knew it. And my yes, and Ryan's yes in that moment, is all God needed. Then God spoke to the fish, and it vomited up Ryan and Kristen on the Las Vegas Strip. That is what happened, all right? And you know the rest of the story. All right, so listen, the moment we prayerfully opened the door to Las Vegas was the moment when things started to feel a whole lot less convoluted and a whole lot more right. I mean, we were really scared, but it was the kind of scared that's good, that kind that propels you to kind of move your feet. So it was good, all right? And so that leads right into the third thing that Jonah shows us in all of this. Third thing we need to do when we don't want to, after we have checked our attitudes and our idols and we've prayed, is we need to do it anyway. Most of the time, we don't want to obey because we are scared of what it might cost us. Be it resources, reputation, security, comfort, you name it. And I think sometimes we're even scared that we heard God wrong, or that maybe he called the wrong person because we're not up for the task. We need to do it anyway and see what happens. Because he's not going to lead us astray. He's just not. We need to do it anyway, not because we want to, but because he told us to. Last I checked, he was God and we are not. It's harsh, but like it's true. And he knows what's best for us. And, I have to imagine that when Jonah stood up on that beach after the fish spit him out, I imagine he wasn't feeling so great. Like he had to have been tired. He was certainly smelly. He was probably hungry. And he was still maybe just a little bit freaked out by what just happened. And so when he gets out onto that shore and God says to him a second time, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you, Jonah probably had a lot of reasons to continue to stall. But he didn't. It says in Jonah 3:3, Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. I think the most inspiring words in all of Jonah's stories are in that verse, and they are the words, he began. He began in spite of his fatigue, in spite of his fear, in spite of his not fully knowing the outcome of his obedience. He did what God said in spite of all of that. And we get to as well. We get to. We don't have to, we get to. It's a privilege to be called by God to do things and partner with him in restoring this broken world. And so I don't know what obedience looks like for you right now. I mean, I hope throughout this series you've been able to kind of turn that over in your mind and in your heart and see what that looks like. I don't know what it looks like, but I promise it can involve beginning and taking one step after another, even if you're feeling scared or tired or uncertain. And, it doesn't have to be this major thing, right? Like, I know some of you probably have a knot in your stomach right now because you have to go to work tomorrow and work for someone who's a total Looney Tune. Like, you don't like your boss. But obedience for you is showing up and doing the job anyway because your family needs you to provide for them. Others of you, there might be someone in your family right now who is sick and struggling, and God has said, you know what, you need to be the one to care for them. And that takes it out of you. Believe me, I know. And so your act of obedience is just to show up and say, here I am, Lord. Maybe you're a student and you don't understand why you have to go to school. But it's your job just to show up tomorrow and to take steps forward in your learning so that God can prepare you to do big things in this world. It can be big and small. I'll just give you one more example. About a month ago, I realized, we've been living next to these people for 2.5 years, and we've not invited them over for dinner. And last time I got up here and preached a whole message about how awesome of a neighbor I was. True story. And so I was like, I cannot get up here and tell Genesis Church that they need to obey when God is calling me to text my neighbor and say, will you come over for dinner? Like, I couldn't get up here in good conscience and do this without having done that. And so we did. A couple weeks ago, neighbors came over. It was awesome. And Ryan and I said it 100 times. Why didn't we do that sooner? Should have done that sooner. Okay, so obedience can be anything in your path. All right, so when we don't want to obey, we begin anyway. And I promise that when you do, God will sustain and surprise and change you. And along the way, here's the good news. People will get set free because of your obedience, and their lives will change too. Change lives, changing lives. That's what we're doing here, guys. That's what we're doing here, okay? So, Jonah obeys, and the people of Nineveh, surprise, they do too. Thereby shifting the entire point of Jonah's story. No longer will Jonah's life be defined by his disobedience. Instead, his life would forever speak to the power and the grace of God to work through his disobedience and into his obedience to produce something for God's glory. After 3 days, the fish spat Jonah safely out onto a sandy beach. Just then, Jonah heard someone calling his name. Go to Nineveh, God said. And this time, Jonah said yes. He went straight to Nineveh and told everyone God's wonderful message. Even though you're far from God, he can't stop loving you, Jonah said. Run to him so he can forgive you. The people of Nineveh listened to Jonah, and they started loving God. They learned to do what God said and to stop running away from him, just like Jonah. Many years later, God was going to send another messenger with the same wonderful message. Like Jonah, he would spend 3 days in utter darkness. But this messenger would be God's own son. He would be called the Word, because he himself would be God's message. God's message translated into our own language. Everything God wanted to do and say to the whole world in a person. Let's pray. God, we confess today that we set out trying to be like heroes of the Bible, like Abraham and Sarah, and then you ask us to do something we don't want to do, and we realize, whoa, we're far more like Jonah than we realize. We are sorry for that. But we are thankful, God, that because of Jesus, you make all things new. And you give us new chances every day to say yes to the things that you are calling us to do and be in this world. It's a privilege, and Lord, I hope that we will walk out of this place a little more aware who you are and what you have for us if we would just believe you. So help us be bold. Help us be brave. Help us to see that obeying you is the very best thing. It leads to the very best places. It led Jesus to the cross, which led us to eternal life with you. We cannot thank you enough for that today, Lord. So please, do a new thing in us.